Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see so many friends here. Welcome back to the Miller Center and to our latest lecture in the Historical Presidency series. I'm Will Hitchcock. As you know, as some of you know, I direct the academic programs here at the Miller Center. The Miller Center is a research center for the study of important public policy issues, and in particular, we focus on the history and the functioning of the presidency, the chief executive. About a little more than 2 years ago, a little less than 2 years ago, we started a new presidential lecture series, inviting scholars to come to the Miller Center to discuss, in particular, the way that American presidents have handled particularly acute times of crisis, whether in war or domestic crisis. We've had a wonderful run with the lecture series. We started in our first 18 months or so. We wanted to focus on the 19th century and from the founding right up through the 19th century, because we felt our bias at the Miller Center had been very much post-1945, and we are aware there have been 44 presidents, and we wanted to go back and include them all. And we did that in a wonderful series of lectures dealing with the 19th century. We covered Jefferson, Madison, Jackson, Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, and U.S. Grant. We even had a lecture on a U.S. president, a president who was not a U.S. president, namely Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederate States of America. Well, this year we're focusing on 20th century presidencies. We began last month with a lecture by Margaret Macmillan on the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, and we'll be continuing over the course of this calendar year with lectures on Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, and Ronald Reagan. We'll have two on Roosevelt, since he is a sort of an elephant in the room, so he gets two. Well, let me tell you how the program is going to go today. Some of you are veterans of this and you know the drill, but I'll remind, for those of you who have not seen it before, I'm going to turn the podium over to my colleague Mel Leffler in a moment, and he will introduce our distinguished guest today. And then after Mr. Nash speaks, he and Mel will have 15 minutes or so of Q&A together, a little conversation to rough out some of the themes that Mr. Nash will bring up. And after that, we'll open it up to a Q&A from the audience. We do want to make sure to take your questions, and we'll do that. It gives me then great pleasure to introduce my friend and my colleague, Mel Leffler, who is one of the University of Virginia's most distinguished faculty members. Mel Leffler holds the Edward Stettinius Chair in American History, and he is the author of numerous books on the history of American foreign policy and national security. His most recent sole-authored and prize-winning book is For the Soul of Mankind, the United States, the Soviet Union, and the Cold War. And he's edited and authored many other of the absolutely foundational books in U.S. And Cold War history. He is a friend and a distinguished associated faculty member here at the Miller Center, and it's great to have him leading this 20th Century Lecture Series, and I'd like to ask him to come up and take the podium. Mel.
Thanks a lot, Will. I appreciate it. It's my real pleasure to introduce George Nash to give this lecture today on Herbert Hoover and the crisis of the Great Depression. George Nash is one of the foremost scholars of American conservatism in the United States. Unlike most of us whose dissertations go unread, George's dissertation, which focused on the intellectual conservative movement in America, was published shortly after he finished it, and to this date, the conservative intellectual movement in America, which he first wrote in 1976, and which has gone through several editions since then, is one of the most foundational texts for understanding modern American conservatism. In addition, a few years ago, 2009, George wrote another book on conservatism, reappraising the right, the past, and future of American conservatism. He has spoken extensively on this topic in many different venues. But I really was interested in getting George Nash to come here to talk about Herbert Hoover and the Great Depression, because George is arguably the foremost historian and biographer of Herbert Hoover. He's written a monumental 3-volume biography that he worked on for roughly 15 or 20 years, I think, from the mid-1970s to the mid-1990s. Since then, George has written several other monographs about Herbert Hoover, and in recent years he has found, after all this time, some 2 texts of books that Hoover himself had been working on for much of his post-presidential career, that he worked and reworked and reworked and had a bunch of research assistants working for him. The thrust of both these books was, on the one hand, to indict Franklin Roosevelt's foreign policies, and the thrust of the other one was to indict Franklin Roosevelt's domestic policies. But these are extraordinarily scholarly, thoughtful efforts by Hoover, in which he put in a monumental amount of time. And whether you agree with them or disagree with them, he mobilized an extraordinary amount of factual information. George Nash was one of the historians who went to West Branch, Iowa in the mid-1970s to begin research in the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library. One of the interesting things about Herbert Hoover, which I think worked out much to his disadvantage, was that after his presidency, he spent much of his time attacking Franklin Roosevelt. He did also participate in 2 very significant presidential commissions under Harry Truman, who brought Hoover back to do a number of important things. But Hoover himself, in total contrast to Roosevelt, kept his own papers pretty much closed up for most of his retired career while he was alive. And so he died in the late 1960s, and the Presidential Library opened for real research only in the early 1970s. And a bunch of people, George foremost amongst them, but other young scholars, including myself, went to the Hoover Library in the mid-1970s and began doing research in the Hoover papers. And the Hoover we discovered was a pretty surprising Herbert Hoover. And it led to a great deal of scholarship that was published in the mid-late 70s and 1980s that totally recast the image of Herbert Hoover and the American presidency. Perhaps, the book most remembered that sums up was a book by, at the time, a young scholar named Joan Hoff Wilson, in which she called her little book on Herbert Hoover, quote, "Herbert Hoover, Forgotten Progressive." Nobody for decades had thought of Herbert Hoover as a progressive, and yet the opening of the papers led to a really sort of recasting of Herbert Hoover. No one wanted to make him into a liberal, but plenty of people wanted to see him in a different tradition than the staunch anti-New Dealer that he seemed to almost everybody. And as his papers became available, a much more sympathetic view of Hoover emerged, and it sort of created this stark contrast. Franklin Roosevelt, of course, died while he was in office, but the Franklin Roosevelt Library opened right away, and it led historians who went there to get into his papers. And of course, what happens is what always happens. When historians actually see the papers of a person, you sort of get co-opted into that person's worldview, and you become sympathetic. A whole bunch of people became sympathetic to FDR for all sorts of reasons, but one of which was you saw the world increasingly through his eyes. No one saw the world through Herbert Hoover's eyes until the 1970s, and then when his papers opened up, you saw a different Herbert Hoover and you got a different perspective on the presidency. I use this little talk to constantly convince contemporary policymakers to open their papers quickly. It will lead to a more empathetic view. I told this exact story to Donald Rumsfeld when he visited here about 3 years ago, and I said, Secretary Rumsfeld, you really should open up your papers. It will lead to a much more empathetic view of your career as Secretary of Defense. And he said he would think about it, and he is still thinking about it. With that introduction, I'm delighted to present George Nash.
Thank you very much, Mel, for that very gracious introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure and indeed an honor to be in your company today as a guest of the Miller Center. And Mel and Professor Hitchcock, I want to thank you and your colleagues for inviting me to participate in this lecture series and for all of the courtesies that have been extended to me. On March 4th, 1929, Herbert Hoover was sitting upon top of the world. As he took his oath of office that day to be President of the United States, he could look back on a career path whose trajectory had curved unbrokenly upward. Born of Quaker parents in Iowa in 1874 and orphaned before he was 10, by 1914, Hoover was an internationally acclaimed mining engineer living in London. When World War I broke out that year, he quickly became an international humanitarian hero by creating an unprecedented relief commission that delivered food for more than 4 years to the entire civilian population of German-occupied Belgium, which was under constant threat of starvation. Belgium was just the beginning. Between 1914 and the early 1920s, Hoover directed, financed, or assisted a multitude of relief endeavors in Europe without parallel in the history of humankind. Tens of millions of people owed their lives to his exertions. It was later said of him that he was responsible for saving more lives than any other person in history. During the 1920s, the great engineer, as some now called him, ascended still higher on the ladder of public esteem. As Secretary of Commerce under Presidents Harding and Coolidge, Hoover became one of the 3 or 4 most important, most influential men in the US government. It was said of him that he was Secretary of Commerce and Undersecretary of all other departments, a fact not always appreciated by the other cabinet secretaries, I might add. Driving Hoover's hyperactivity was a well-developed political philosophy and a style of leadership that some would call the Hoover Method. In the chaotic aftermath of World War I, he had begun to seek a middle way between what he termed the economic, social patent medicines of Europe and the unrestricted capitalism of Adam Smith. In 1922, he distilled his thinking into a little book entitled American Individualism. By this term, he did not mean old-fashioned laissez-faire, which he explicitly repudiated, but rather a social philosophy grounded in what he considered to be America's most precious social ideal, the ideal of equality of opportunity. As a self-styled progressive, Hoover accepted some governmental regulation of private enterprise to protect and foster equality of opportunity. But he emphatically rejected old world statism and such notions as governmental operation of business. To him, the amalgam that he labeled American individualism was an organic thing which had been growing for hundreds of years, and it had made America unique and, in his view, preeminently successful among the nations. Hoover was too much the engineer, too much the temperamental activist, too much the advocate of science-based meliorism to content himself with praising America's existing social system in a book. As the Secretary of Commerce looked about him in the 1920s, he found a society beset by what he called waste, including the terrible waste of unemployment during depressions. When the nation's economy fell into a severe recession in 1920 and 21, he persuaded Warren Harding in August of that year, 21, to convene a president's conference on unemployment, with Hoover as its chairman and driving force. This highly publicized conference laid the intellectual foundation for his presidential response to the Great Depression a decade later. The conference and a parade of follow-up studies by experts that Hoover commissioned popularized the idea that government should not sit still during economic slumps. To the contrary, it should act to mitigate such downturns, especially by counter-cyclical expenditures on public works. Hoover scoffed at the classical economic teaching that business cycle fluctuations were inevitable and impervious to successful regulation. Instead, he believed that the national economy could be managed by systematic cooperation and coordination, one of his favorite words, between the federal government and a private sector imbued, in his words, with a rising vision of service. At the heart of his method of social betterment was a vision of a vast informal partnership between a federal government equipped with scientific data about economic and social conditions and a private economy led by enlightened trade associations, which burgeoned and multiplied in the 1920s. And during that decade, Hoover labored ceaselessly to actualize his vision by such means as convening literally hundreds of conferences, more than 1,200, in Washington of bureaucrats and businessmen on such subjects as the standardization of products and the elimination of waste in the economy. His approach came to be known, especially to historians, as associationalism. To him, it was a proven progressive formula for non-coercive, non-political promotion of the general welfare. By 1928, Hoover's reputation was immense. As he campaigned for the presidency that year, some of his supporters produced a film about him with the title Herbert Hoover, Master of Emergencies. You can actually watch it on YouTube today. In November, he was elected president in a landslide and without ever having held an elective public office. Once inaugurated, Hoover acted quickly to fulfill the public's great expectations. He called Congress into a special session to enact relief legislation for agriculture. Congress soon passed the Agricultural Marketing Act, encouraging farm cooperatives, Hoover's favorite solution to the farm problem. He invited Congress to make limited changes in the government's tariff schedules and initiated plans for a host of other reform projects. Privately, however, the new president was not as sanguine about the future as he appeared to be. For several years, he had watched with apprehension as the stock market had soared to spectacular heights, a surge increasingly fueled by massive investor borrowing of money to buy shares. Borrowing on margin, it was called. As Secretary of Commerce, he had tried in vain in 1926, thereabouts, mid-20s, behind the scenes to nudge the Federal Reserve Board into restraining the bull market. In the spring and summer of 1929, the nervous chief executive again attempted to persuade the Federal Reserve Board and the barons of Wall Street as well to break the speculative fever. His largely covert actions had little effect. When the crash finally came in October, Hoover's first response was to assure the nation that the fundamental business of the country, the production and distribution of commodities, was on a sound and prosperous basis. He wanted to isolate the problem to the financial sector, the stock market. The underlying economy, he said, was sound. But as the stock market's downward spiral continued, he realized that the debacle's effects had not been confined to Wall Street. The national psyche itself had suffered a shock. If the spreading mood of fear, uncertainty, and hesitation in business were not checked, he said, the economy could plunge into a grievous depression. Hoover now took steps that changed the course of American history. Instead of allowing the business downturn to run its course, as his conservative Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, recommended, Hoover intervened on a scale unmatched by any previous president. Convinced that the country's difficulties were, in his words, psychological, not logical, he launched a national campaign to alter not the economy, but false perceptions of it. In November and December of 1929, Hoover dominated the public stage with a flourish of presidential activism. He convened a series of conferences at the White House with business leaders who listened to his appeals and pledged, in defiance of classical economic theory, to maintain wage scales at their current level. A high wage policy, he and others argued, would sustain purchasing power and thus stimulate future production of goods. Hoover also conferred with labor leaders who promised not to strike or seek destabilizing wage increases during the emergency. To counter an expected uptick in unemployment, he promised that the federal government would augment its public works expenditures in a big way. He called on leading industries to do that as well, and he asked the nation's governors to do the same. To Hoover, these measures were not eccentric nostrums. They reflected the teachings of the increasingly popular proto-Keynesian new economics that he and many others had been promulgating since the unemployment conference of 1921. His program for recovery and his method of cooperating with the best minds in the private sector won widespread public support. In effect, Hoover was practicing a kind of psychotherapy designed to restore the nation's badly shattered confidence. Confidence, that to him was the key to renewal of prosperity. By stabilizing the economy through a high wage policy, industrial peace, countercyclical public work spending, and other actions, he believed that he could defeat what he called the fear of unemployment and the emotions that were threatening an economic breakdown. Both then and forever after, Hoover was proud of the extraordinary agreements he had forged, proud of his break with the austere fatalism of laissez-faire. Confidently, deliberately, and self-consciously, he had abandoned the principle of political non-interference with the business cycle. As never before, the President of the United States had placed one man, himself, in charge of guiding the nation back to prosperity. And having done so, he was quick to proclaim success. On March 7th, 1930, just about 4 or 5 months after the crash, he told a news conference that all the evidences indicate that the worst effects of the crash upon employment will have been passed during the next 60 days. In April, he told an audience that the miseries of unemployment from speculative crashes were being cured before our eyes by voluntary cooperation between industry and government. On May 1st, 1930, in an address to the Chamber of Commerce of the United States, he said, "I am convinced we have now passed the worst, and with continued unity of effort, we shall rapidly recover." He declared that his great economic experiment, his term, had, again in his words, succeeded to a remarkable degree. Hoover's optimistic prophecies of early 1930 eventually cost him dearly in public disillusionment. But at this juncture, they did not appear so outlandish. Many other seasoned observers, including distinguished economists, shared his belief that the worst was or very soon would be over, and many gave him credit for calming the public mood right after the crash. For a time, it appeared that the Hoover method of cooperative action outside of government had been vindicated. And in fact, in the early months of 1930, the stock market recovered much of the ground it had lost during the previous autumn. But then, as would happen repeatedly in the next 3 years, just when Hoover thought that he had restored economic equilibrium, unexpected turbulence arose. In June 1930, after months of bitter recrimination, Congress enacted and Hoover approved the highly protectionist Smoot-Hawley tariff. Hoover took solace from its flexible rate provision that permitted the president, upon recommendation by the Tariff Commission, to raise or reduce individual rates by 50%. In this way, the White House technocrat reasoned, he could take tariff making out of politics, out of the log rolling process on Capitol Hill, and adjust rates in a calm manner on a scientific basis. And that was what he really wanted out of that tariff legislation, the right to adjust rates scientifically later. Just how destructive the Smoot-Hawley tariff proved to be remains a subject of debate among economists and historians. But psychologically, the impending enactment of that law appeared to deal a considerable blow to the edifice of confidence that Hoover had been building. As the congressional struggle over the tariff reached a climax, the stock market tumbled in what was described as a torrent of liquidation. By mid-June, when the new tariff took effect, the market had wiped out virtually all of its gains of the past 7 months. Then, in the summer of 1930, across much of the Midwest and South, the worst drought yet recorded in American history ravaged the crops of 30 states. Millions of acres of planted fields were ruined. Farm income in the devastated region fell by 25%. No one could blame Hoover for the drought. But as 1930 wore on, a number of influential commentators became critical of his performance so far as president. Time and again, they accused him of timidity and vacillation in his dealings with Congress. However impressive he was in cooperating with business people and other elites outside Washington, his leadership vis-a-vis his official peers inside Washington seemed at best maladroit. Hoover, said the pundit Walter Lippmann, suffered from a peculiar weakness. He had not yet mastered the political art. He was, said Lippmann, weak in the presence of politics and politicians. It is easy enough to see why politicians in both parties distrusted him. He was simply not one of their kind. his aura of impersonal efficiency, dislike of political rituals, workaholic seriousness, reliance on non-political experts, and aversion to small talk set him apart from what he derided as the beer garden on Capitol Hill. That was during the time of Prohibition. He was also difficult to pin down ideologically. His unusual blend of progressivism and anti-statism pleased neither the left nor the right. Although Hoover gradually became more assertive in his handling of Congress, the interaction between them was rarely smooth. His method of cooperation seemed to leave little room for congressional cooperation in combating the Depression, at least in its early stages. For his part, Hoover believed, as he told an audience shortly after the crash, that the most dangerous man in America, or the most dangerous animal in America, is the man with an emotion and a desire to pass a new law. Congress, he added pointedly, cannot inspire or lead voluntary forces. Privately, he was more pungent. He labeled one senator the only verified case of a negative IQ. I've never been able to find out who it was, but when in 1930 one of Hoover's granddaughters was born, his first response supposedly was, "I'm glad she doesn't have to be confirmed by the Senate." In a whimsical mood one day, he remarked, "There ought to be a law allowing the president to hang 2 men a year and without being required to give any reason." As the political headwinds against him gathered force, the president gave little sign of reconsidering his method or his message. Convinced as ever that the key to recovery was the revival of a spirit of confidence, he asked the American Bankers Association in October 1930 to instill a feeling of assurance in their clients. He appealed to the cautious bankers, and bankers, I think, are always cautious, to improve their borrowers' courage and mental attitude, Hoover's terms. He wanted the bankers to do that. In December, he advised Congress that the road to economic healing lay in cooperative action at America's grassroots, and that the best contribution government could make was to encourage what he called the voluntary cooperation of the community. In November 1930, the Democrats made sweeping gains in the congressional elections. Until that point, Hoover had largely controlled the headlines with his anti-depression initiatives. But as 1930 yielded to 1931, and the Depression persisted, he found himself increasingly outflanked on his left and forced onto the ideological defensive. Much of the political argument focused less on how to end the Depression than how to deal with its growing toll in human misery. Early in 1931, Congress debated how to assist the impoverished farmers in the South who had been ruined by the recent drought. Should the federal government break precedent and provide direct financial assistance, the so-called dole, to farmers for human needs, as opposed to loan money to buy seeds and feed their livestock and so forth? Should there be direct federal money going for human needs? To the consternation of his senatorial critics, the president said no. The American Red Cross he assisted, which had been distributing food to drought victims for months, was fully capable of handling cases of what he called individual distress. After 2 months of angry political warfare between the White House and Capitol Hill, drought relief legislation was enacted which technically averted the dreaded dole. But Hoover's humanitarian reputation had been bruised, and he was virtually compelled to declare publicly that if the nation's traditional relief agencies should ever be unable to prevent hunger and suffering, he would then ask for the aid of every resource of the federal government. But that moment for Hoover had not yet arrived. Just days after the drought relief brouhaha on Capitol Hill, and for months thereafter, he exhorted his fellow Americans to maintain their traditional system of mutual self-help, voluntary giving, and local governmental responsibility for people in need. Any tapping into the federal coffers, he warned, any federal usurpation of these responsibilities would strike at the roots of self-government and lay the foundations for the destruction of our liberties. Sounding at times like an Old Testament prophet, he admonished Americans to solve their problems outside of government and reject what he called the opiates of public charity. And most of the country agreed with him at that point, I should add. Meanwhile, new manifestations of what Hoover called frozen confidence were appearing. In the autumn of 1930, a growing number of significant American banks had begun to fail. In 1931, the pace dramatically quickened, abetted by a deepening financial crisis in Europe that threatened to drag some powerful American banks into the maelstrom. In September 1931, the turmoil abroad took a stunning turn when Great Britain was forced to abandon the almost sacrosanct gold standard. Britain's decision triggered a financial tsunami in the United States. Fearful that the US dollar would be the next currency to devalue, many foreign depositors rushed to withdraw their holdings in American banks in the form of gold. Many domestic depositors also sought safety by withdrawing their savings from banks and hoarding the money at home. Lacking sufficient reserves to accommodate the stampede, more than 500 American banks collapsed in a single month. By the end of December 1931, a total of 2,294 American banks had failed during that year. The figure had been about 1,300 the year before. Desperate to stem what he called a degenerating vicious cycle, Hoover reached out to the nation's banking elite. Early in October, he secretly convened a group of leading New York bankers at the Washington home of Andrew Mellon. He asked them, in the name of the public interest, to voluntarily organize a private banking pool, soon called the National Credit Corporation, with a capital of $500 million to be supplied by the banking community itself. The corporation would use this fund to lend assistance to banks that, in Hoover's words, were under attack by unreasoning depositors. By rescuing these banks from the danger of closure, the corporation, he hoped, would stabilize the nation's credit structure and revive public confidence. There's that word again, public confidence in the banking system. The powerful New York bankers reluctantly acquiesced, but only after Hoover promised them that if necessity requires, that's a quotation from Hoover, he would ask Congress to create a governmental banking entity patterned after the War Finance Corporation of World War I. It soon transpired that the worried bankers had less faith in Hoover's type of cooperation than he did. Unwilling to risk their own capital to save their weaker brethren, and anxious by now for Uncle Sam to assume the burden, the pool's organizers procrastinated and loaned out less than $10 million in the first weeks of the corporation's existence. For Hoover, the fateful moment of decision was now at hand. According to an old adage popularized by H.L. Mencken, in politics, a man must learn to rise above principle. This Herbert Hoover now did. Yielding to the perceived dictates of necessity, in December 1931, he formally called upon Congress to enact a program of emergency governmental action to end the nation's growing credit paralysis. He asked Congress to establish a Reconstruction Finance Corporation with broad powers to lend money directly to beleaguered banks and certain other commercial institutions. Never before had a peacetime president proposed to intervene so massively in the workings of private enterprise. Not bankers, not investors, not captains of industry, but the government itself would now attempt to lubricate the nation's credit channels and make the wheels of commerce turn again. In January 1932, Congress voted overwhelmingly to establish the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. With a prodigious $2 billion in lending power. That may not sound so much to you, but the entire federal budget in that year was about $4 billion. During the next 5 months, the RFC authorized more than 5,000 loans to more than 4,000 banks and other commercial institutions in difficulty. The RFC did not restore the nation's confidence. Many banks, fearful of runs on their scarce reserves, refused to resume significant lending. And untold numbers of bank depositors continued to hoard their savings rather than risk losing them in rickety local banks. But the RFC did save many businesses from ruin and quelled local and regional financial brush fires that might easily have turned into a national conflagration. Yet even as Hoover embraced government-funded credit expansion and other intrusions into the market economy, he simultaneously donned the heavy armor of fiscal conservatism. If confidence in the economy was to be revived, he announced, the federal government must rigorously balance its budget, which was now running its largest peacetime deficit in American history. The perceived stability of the United States government, as measured by a balanced budget, was absolutely essential, he believed, if the government were to prevent another disastrous run on the dollar like the one the previous autumn and preserve the all-important gold standard. This, incidentally, was not just Hoover's thinking in 1932. It was the prevailing economic orthodoxy of the time. As Hoover was promoting increase of taxes, Franklin Roosevelt was doubling the income tax in the state of New York, for example. Few Republicans or Democrats dissented from Hoover's basic argument. And so in June 1932, Congress enacted and Hoover signed into law the largest peacetime tax increase up to that date in American history. Meanwhile, the clamor for direct federal aid for needy individuals was intensifying. Back in August 1931, Hoover had established the President's Organization on Unemployment Relief to coordinate the country's relief preparations for the coming winter. The new committee would dispense no federal money. Rather, it would assist the existing network of local, state, and non-governmental relief agencies in an elaborate national campaign for private contributions. In mid-October, Hoover himself initiated the appeal on national radio. By early winter, when the effort wound up, it had raised approximately $100 million. It had been the most successful volunteer fund drive in American history, a tribute to Hoover's political faith and his method. But was it enough? Many on Capitol Hill did not think so. In February 1932, various factions in the U.S. Senate attempted to legislate direct federal assistance to the states for relief purposes. With Hoover ready to use his veto pen if necessary, the Senate voted down every bill that was proposed. But less than 3 months later, Hoover's dike against federal intervention suddenly broke. On May 11th, the Democrats' conservative Senate leader, Joseph Robinson of Arkansas, introduced a bill that, among other things, would provide $300 million in federal loans to states and municipalities too, in relief of suffering caused by unemployment. Robinson's legislative challenge to Hooverian orthodoxy was the handiwork of two of the foremost Democratic business leaders in the country, the financier Bernard Baruch and the chairman of the board of General Electric, Owen D. Young. And Hoover realized at once what it meant. The conservative Democratic establishment, which had been with him in February, had deserted him. Within hours of Robinson's dramatic Senate speech, Hoover's will to resist on the plane of principle evaporated. The very next morning, he informed his press secretary that they must prevent Robinson and the Democrats from snitching all the credit for aid to states and broadening relief work. Instead, then, of sternly rebuking Robinson, the president invited the startled senator to the White House, praised his speech, agreed with him on the need for federal relief funding for the states, and audaciously proposed to put Robinson's relief plan in modified form into the hands of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, Hoover's creation. Although Hoover at once insisted that the fundamental policy of state, local, and private responsibility for relief had not changed, there was no denying that he had just compromised the philosophic underpinnings of his presidency. He had been forced by partisan necessity and by a growing national consensus to rise above principle again. Hoover's political somersault, as one enemy called it, astonished official Washington and touched off a 2-month Donnybrook with Congress over the precise terms of the legislation. As finally enacted in July of 1932, the Emergency Relief and Construction Act, among other things, authorized the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to lend up to $300 million for the states to finance relief for needy and distressed people. Like the RFC, the Emergency Relief and Construction Act broke the barriers to a new era of big government. By accepting federal intervention in this form, first for economic recovery and then for general relief, Hoover and Congress had taken a major step toward Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. And having done so, Hoover, the apostle of voluntarism, was determined to go no further. In the autumn of 1932, as he campaigned for re-election, he strenuously reaffirmed his faith, and again I quote his words, in self-government by the people outside of the government, and lashed out at the statist regimentation that he sensed would be at the heart of the New Deal. In a climactic campaign address, he warned that the election was more than a contest between two men or two parties. It was, he said, a contest between two philosophies of government, and its outcome would determine the nation's course for over a century to come. For the rest of his life, he regarded this as one of his most prophetic utterances. In 1933, Hoover left office a political pariah. But this was not the end of the story. Rising from the ashes of his political immolation, he waged until his death in 1964 what he called a crusade against collectivism, and became Franklin Roosevelt's most formidable critic from the right. During his 4 years as president, Hoover, in certain ways, foreshadowed the New Deal. But in the larger sweep of the 20th century, Hoover, as a former president, contributed mightily to containing the New Deal and to reinvigorating the political philosophy that he had expounded in the White House. In the process, he forged a critique of ever-aggrandizing statism that has become integral to modern American conservatism. It was among the most enduring of his legacies. So, how shall we judge Hoover's leadership as he confronted America's greatest trauma since the Civil War? It seems to be a near consensus among historians that Hoover's presidency was a failure. According to one narrative, favored by most historians and shaped by Keynesian economics, Hoover fell short because he was too anti-statist, too committed to voluntarism, and too devoted to fiscal conservatism and the gold standard. In this interpretation, the Great Depression was a crisis of American capitalism, and Hoover's failing was that he did too little, too late. A competing narrative, favored by many free market economists, argues that the Great Depression was not a crisis of capitalism, but a failure of government, whose interventionist policies profoundly exacerbated the nation's economic woes. Among these policies, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, the tax increase of 1932, and the high wage policy that Hoover insisted upon in 1929. According to some recent economic research, Hoover's high wage policy had the actual effect of raising unemployment to staggering levels that it would otherwise not have attained. In this line of interpretation, Hoover's failing was not that he did too little, but that he did too much. Both of these schools of scholarship, you will notice, are Hoover-centric. But there is another perspective on him that I invite you to consider as I close. Between 1929 and 1933, the supply of money in the United States contracted by nearly 1/3, a staggering, almost unbelievable decline. Why did this happen? In their monumental Monetary History of the United States, published in 1963, Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz placed the blame squarely on the policies, passivity, and ineptitude of the Federal Reserve Board, the nation's legal guardian of our monetary system. It is a complicated story, but in the judgment of Friedman and Schwartz, it was the Fed that was mainly responsible for converting a garden variety recession into a major catastrophe. Since 1963, Friedman and Schwartz's indictment of the Fed has won considerable acceptance among economists and reinforcement from the Fed's principal historian, Alan Meltzer, as a significant contribution to understanding the severity of America's Great Depression. It is my impression, however, that historians as a class have not fully pondered the indictment's implications. For, if Friedman, Schwartz, and their fellow monetarists are substantially correct, what should historians now say about Hoover? In all our history, no president has been more conscientious and hardworking than he. For 3 years and more, he strove without stint to induce the American people to shake off their frozen confidence. Repeatedly, he pleaded with banks to resume lending, with depositors to stop hoarding, and for morale-building action that would arrest the deepening credit freeze. Could it be that his incessant labors were not so much right or wrong as irrelevant? It reminds me of the Greek mythological figure Sisyphus, forever condemned to push a heavy boulder up a hill. Every time he nearly reached the top, the rock would roll back down, and Sisyphus would have to start over. From 1929 to 1933, Herbert Hoover arguably was our modern Sisyphus. Every time that he seemed to be on the brink of success in taming the Great Depression, some new crisis would erupt while the silent killer, the contraction of the money supply, would grind on. Each time, like Sisyphus, he would start over, unaware that much of his perpetual motion may have been doomed to futility by the monetary policies of a government agency beyond his control. So I leave you with this food for thought. Perhaps someday historians will conclude that Hoover's presidency was stymied not so much by his political limitations or his leadership methods or even by his political philosophy and policies, but by something neither he nor virtually anyone else at the time quite understood: the fatal misjudgments and errors of the Federal Reserve Board. Thank you.
George, that was a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
We see Hoover in an interesting light, both being active but at the same time delimited, and ultimately you give us a very monetarist view of the Great Depression and of the reasons why the Depression was as prolonged as it was. So the first question here has to be, if you assign so much responsibility to the role of the Fed, what actually motivated the Fed's actions? Why was the monetary supply reduced? To what extent was Hoover aware of this at the time? To what extent were these policies discussed? I might say parenthetically that, of course, Ben Bernanke has learned the same lesson, right? Expand the monetary supply, find new ways of doing it. But talking about the context of the Depression, what actually motivated the people who ran the Fed? Weren't stupid, really, so why were they doing what they were doing? To what extent was Hoover aware of it? To what extent did he wish them to move in a different direction?
Friedman and Schwartz place a great deal of emphasis on the rivalries among the leadership of the Fed, and in particular the peculiar structure of the Federal Reserve System at that point. It occurred to me as I looked at the Fed, and I don't pretend to be a monetary specialist, I'm advancing that as a kind of hypothesis, as a fresh way perhaps of looking more systematically at Hoover if this viewpoint has validity. What struck me about the Fed, it was like the Articles of Confederation. There were 12 Federal Reserve banks in 12 districts with a very weak central authority. The principal bank, the most prestigious one, was the New York Fed. And that's for obvious reasons. New York was the economic center of the country and closer to Europe and so forth. But there was very little agreement among those people as to any kind of policy. In fact, what was startling for me to learn, I didn't know it until recently while researching this paper, was that each individual district, for example, could have its own interest rates, its own loan rates and so forth. There was no great coordination. So there were structural issues. There were personality clashes. Friedman and Schwartz emphasized this kind of thing. Benjamin Strong was the head of the New York Fed until his death in 1928. He was probably the most eminent central banker, if you will, of his day. And Friedman and Schwartz placed great stress on this point, that if Strong had lived, he, with his expertise and sophistication and forcefulness of personality, would have been able to overpower the inertia and some of this jealousy and highly decentralized decision-making or lack of decision-making inherent in the system. So they put a great deal of stress on that. Alan Meltzer, just a few years ago, basically writes in the same general framework as the Friedman and Schwartz. And he has a 2-volume history of the Federal Reserve Board, and he goes into the exact same issue, and I would say broadly agrees that the Fed made all sorts of errors. But Meltzer is more of an intellectual historian, you might say, in his approach. He emphasizes what was inside the heads of all of these rival actors in this rather disorganized system that didn't lend itself to coherent policy making. So he moves beyond personalities and structural factors to looking at what was the motivating policy or strategy. And that gets us to something arcane called the real bills doctrine, or sometimes the Riefler-Burgess doctrine, which seems to have been a variant of that. This was the model that the Federal Reserve leaders, most of them, adhered to. And the basic point of that model was that the Fed should loan money to banks when they want it. Money comes after the economy improves. So the Fed will be waiting for the banks to need money to lend. So the economy picks up. So then they put out more money to lubricate it all. Friedman and Schwartz, I should explain before getting too far afield. Their solution was that the Fed should have engaged, as it sporadically did, but rather tepidly and inconsistently, in what were called open market purchases. Purchasing government bonds from banks, you purchase a bond that a bank is holding, and suddenly the bank has more money, which presumably it is now going to lend out, you see. So that was Friedman and Schwartz's solution, you might say, to the problem. But the problem is that most of the Federal Reserve leaders, or many of them, and it was a small group, believed in a doctrine, this real bills doctrine, which was very skeptical of open market purchasing as a tool. They were also very burned as a body by the crash. And many of them interpreted the crash as a consequence of an easy money policy that the Federal Reserve Board had encouraged, low interest rates and so on in the late 20s, which made it easy for lots and lots and lots of people to borrow money to go run to the stock market and buy stocks on margin. So that group inside the Fed was very loath to just start pumping money into the system again, lest they inflate it up and cause another stock market spree. That to us seems strange because, as we know now, there was considerable deflation of about 20 to 25% in prices during that 4-year period. So what the nation was facing right away at that time was deflation, but they were worried about the risk of inflation if they had too easy a money policy. And so this doctrine that they adhered to, and it was spelled out, it was in the 10th annual report of the Federal Reserve. This was not just a kind of a loose conception, but it was a well-formulated doctrine that Carter Glass adhered to in the Senate, many bankers adhered to. It was, there were some dissidents, but it was really a very broadly accepted viewpoint. According to that doctrine, the Fed should not get worried about a decrease in the money supply. It should wait until there's a need to increase it, which will come when the banks want money. So they were reluctant to just throw money at the banks to get them out of trouble. Also, and again, a technical point, and I'm really repeating this, I don't pretend to have had an independent research eureka moment on this, but apparently they misunderstood the real nature of the interest rate situation at the time. Interest rates were very low nominally in 1932, around 1.5% or so. And so to the Fed's mindset at the time, that meant there was easy money. And they looked at the banks, and the banks were keeping excess reserves. The banks had a lot of money on hand, many of them. So they said, oh, well, I guess the banks don't need any money. It's easy. If they want it, they can get it for low interest rates. And so they saw no need to take action. And also they had the view that if they did take action, it might lead to inflation. And part of what was going on here was a feeling that the system had to just be purged of the excesses of the previous decade. So there was that further impetus toward doing very little. So all of that.
To what extent, though, was Hoover aware at all of this problem in contemporary context in 1930, 31, 32? And to what extent were other leading economists or financial analysts discussing this at the time? Was this something that a president should have been aware of at the time, should have been grappling with, based on the context?
I don't think Hoover was particularly aware of this whole, the implications of this contraction of the money supply. Now, money supply is a technical definition. It means what you have in currency and deposits. And what was happening was that more and more people were taking their money out of the banks, and he was certainly aware of that situation, and keeping it at home. But if you take your money out of the bank can't use it as a basis for lending. So you're, in a sense, weakening the bank. And the banks were hanging on to their reserves. They didn't want to spend the money. Why? The Fed thought, oh, well, they're satisfied. They don't need any more. But what was really happening was that they were scared of those unreasoning depositors. So the banks were acting in their self-interest to prop themselves up by hoarding their own assets, so to speak. And Hoover didn't, just to get to fully answer your question, Hoover saw the banks hoarding the assets, and he became highly critical of the banks. He thought they were just being irresponsible. Carter Glass denounced them as only he could. There was a lot of criticism of the banks on this point, but I don't think Hoover saw this. He didn't see what I'm told by economists are just fallacies of this so-called real bills doctrine, which was sort of the dominant paradigm at the time. To answer the other part of your question, there were some dissidents. The famous one, probably the most famous, was Irving Fisher, professor of economics at Yale, and a kind of father of the quantity theory of money. And Fisher went on record a number of times as saying, if Benjamin Strong had lived, it would have been different. We could have ended this recession 2 or 3 years ago if we had had systematic open market purchases, et cetera. And so there were voices out there. But this, from what I've read, a lot of the more conservative bankers and financial types looked upon the quantity theory of money as suspect. It almost seemed like somehow reminiscent of Bryan or something like that. It didn't seem like sound finance. So I think that what I find the most convincing explanation then is moving beyond the structural factors that I cited earlier, is that there was a kind of a world view that they had which dictated passivity and which led, according to Meltzer at least, to fundamental misreading of the interest rate, which was actually not low because of the deflation. It was high and it was a barrier. So Hoover doesn't put all these pieces together, but what Hoover sees is that the RFC is putting money into the banks and the banks are not lending, And
overall a very nice blend of Hoover in the sense of you see him partly as a progressive, partly as an anti-statist, and I think that captures Hoover very very nicely. But as a policymaker, as you point out, he really believed in the role of the state to promote equality of opportunity. That was sort of his framework for examining what is the appropriate role of government. And as you show in this paper, during the Great Depression, as in the recession of 1921 and 22, he actually wanted the federal government to take significant actions. I mean, he was a proto-Keynesian. He believed that the government ultimately should help the financial system. He's, acquiesced, however grudgingly, to Reconstruction Finance Corporation. He went from one thing to another. But then at some point, as you say, and as many books have pointed out, he felt by the end, by 1932, we should go no further. The government has gone far enough. And then he spent the next 35 years criticizing Roosevelt for going, and the New Deal for going too far. My question is this. What criteria did Hoover actually use to determine the legitimate role of the state? What was his framework? Because we see him doing lots of things, and then sort of, arbitrarily he says no further. And I know the generalizations are about we don't want statism and things of that sort. But that's not the way a president really deals with everyday problems. Everyday problems are the ones you spell out here. You know, should we accept the National Credit Corporation? Should we accept the RFC? Should I expect the Emergency Relief Act? So I would like to know, can you sort of explicate the basic framework or criteria that you think Hoover wrestled with when he really thought about the appropriate role of the state?
Yes. Well, he was much affected by what he saw as the social chaos of Europe during the relief period, especially right after World War I. And he speaks about the failure of socialism. And I think what he's really thinking about mainly is the Soviet, the Russia, Leninist Russia at that point. So he feels that socialism or state dirigism of various kinds, and he broadens it out to include fascism and so forth later on, cannot succeed top down. You need to have initiative. You need to have people with freedom to do technological innovation. You had to have the individuals should be able to move freely and use their talents to improve society. You cannot expect to get that from a bureaucracy, a heavily bureaucratic, highly hyper-regulated system. At the same time, you have to have some rules and guidelines and what he called acceptable regulation. But that should not go to the point where government goes, as he would put it, into competition with its own citizens. He thought that that was beyond the bounds, and he said that would lead to degeneracy. You can find this explained in his veto of the bill that was a kind of forerunner of the TVA in March, I think it was, of 1931, where he vetoed it in language that said this is not liberalism, this is not the path of liberalism, to have the government try to go into the business of producing a commodity, in that case electric power. So he draws a line at government operation or at government top-down dictation, but he likes the idea of cooperation, of government as facilitator, bringing people to Washington for conferences, getting people in a room like this. All of you are specialists now on the size of milk bottles, which incidentally were standardized at one of those events and so forth, mattresses, all sorts of things, with some economic, I think, value as a result. But he'd get these people in the room and they would agree on a kind of rational program by a kind of consensus, without a lot of fanfare, by the way. He didn't go in for vulgar, small d democratic politics. So government could provide a platform. Government could collect the statistics. Everyone can use statistics. It's not discriminatory against anyone. And it may sound a little bit odd for me to be talking so much about statistics, but one of the interesting things is it's only in the 1920s that we really start to get systematic development of statistics collection, partly and substantially through the Department of Commerce under Hoover. And we did not know, for example, at the beginning of 1930, how many people were unemployed in the first months of the Depression. We simply did not, there was no mechanism for finding out. So they decided to use the 1930 census as a basis for getting some fairly good data about it. So I stress the point that Hoover was working to make the government a resource to be called upon, but not the big brother to go in the room and say, you do this, you do that, or else. You see, that is where he would pull back. Although he was this kind of hyperkinetic engineer who liked to shape things and move things and so forth, but he was very resistant to the idea of top-down bureaucratic control. And he thought that that was inconsistent with the American system of equality of opportunity. You wouldn't have it if you had crony capitalism or some kind of very rigid social economic structure. I also think he never forgot the contrast that he perceived between the fluidity of the American social system and what he had experienced as a mining engineer in his formative early years in Australia and England and elsewhere, where he had seen the old world, and he had seen, as he called, America in contrast. One quick anecdote will make, I think, a significant point about him. On one of his many travels around the world and hither and yon as a mining engineer before World War I, he's now a man in his 30s basically, he met on one of those ocean trips, he met a British woman and they had a nice conversation, and she was impressed, I guess, by him, and she finally said, "Well, what do you do, Mr. Hoover?" And he said, "I'm an engineer." "Oh, I thought you were a gentleman." Without even catching herself. But to her, an engineer was a blacksmith or something. Hoover's father was a blacksmith. But to Hoover, an engineer was an educated person with quantitative training and scientific temperament, etc. To him, it was a profession. And he realized, and he commented on this, he realized that if he had been born in England as a son of a blacksmith, he probably wouldn't have gone very far up the ladder. And he saw Britain as having a wonderful elite at the top and a very rich culture that he enjoyed. He loved Shakespeare, for instance, Hoover did. But the rest of the country was more or less frozen into its inherited class status. Hoover, the orphan boy who rose up the ladder, was repelled by that. So he always had this special admiration of America. Some think he idealized it too much, but I think that that's an important part of what he means when he talks about equality of opportunity, which has both a conservative and a liberal cast to it. The liberal might say equality of opportunity, let's work toward it, and Hoover did a lot of that. But also he would say, well, it's a functioning social system. Let us not make great changes that might ruin what we have developed and evolved in freedom. So the conservative side of Hoover gets more prominent. I think it was always there, as he faces what he sees as a huge leap coming with the New Deal in ways that he thought would undermine the American system as he idealized it.
So Hoover, as you're saying, I mean, became the leading conservative critic of the growth of the state. But in your own paper here, could one conclude that the growth of the state itself was the failure, was the consequence of the failure of the private sector and of voluntary cooperation on the local level, that the state itself, the New Deal state, arises principally because the private sector was unwilling to take on or unable to take on the responsibilities that Hoover actually assigned to it, and that local charities and voluntary groups actually were totally exhausted by the pressures of the Depression itself. Hence the state was hence the growth of the role of the state was the inevitable consequence of these developments.
Well, he certainly, and the national consensus, I think, was clear by the middle of '32 that the local and existing relief organizations were exhausted. I mean, he got word from Illinois that in May that by July they'd have no money. There were something like 600,000 people unemployed in the city of Chicago alone. There's no unemployment insurance at the time, by the way, no Social Security, no deposit insurance in the banks. Another great uncertainty factor too. So yes, I think that my own view is that the system at that point could not work on its own. It needed the resources of the federal government. Now, what Hoover saw coming, he thought two things might happen. If we weren't careful, we would get what he called the dole. And that was a term that was frequently used, and the British had instituted some such system, I think, in the early 20s. Someone here may know more than I about that. And so it was not workfare, as we might call it over here, but it was direct cash grants. And there was great resistance in the United States to that, and not just by Hoover. If you look at Roosevelt's WPA and so forth, the men worked and got a wage. It wasn't just handouts. So there was a broad feeling that the government should not create what we now today would call a culture of dependency. And Hoover was afraid that long term, if there's too much of a veering to the state, you would get that. The other thing that he feared was that if you had a politicized relief system, that is a system of money coming from the state, eventually that's going to be politicized, and then you're going to have, he said, a great train of corruption such as we have never before seen. And I would say that, can we say that he was entirely wrong in that? Even in the 1930s, there were WPA scandals that led to the creation of the Hatch Act, for example. The famous, notorious one being the Kentucky primary of 1938, where people getting WPA payments were under pressure to vote for Alvin Barkley rather than Happy Chandler in the primary. So there were cases of scandals of relief administration. Hoover took great pride in his system, these networks that he set up to raise money, and they can be criticized, but he felt that they were being administered by the best minds of the community, the leaders of the community, and who were doing so voluntarily. They were not being paid for it. They had no incentive to act in one way or another. He argued that if that system were dismantled and the government supplanted it, you would have a great decline in the traditional voluntary self-help, et cetera. And in fact, that is in fact what happened, I believe, at least for a time in the 30s. The Red Cross contributions to the Red Cross and so forth declined. So Hoover had some long-term concerns. The problem is the long-term concerns do not immediately link up with the short-term obvious need. And that is partly why I got to reflecting, well, what if Friedman is right? I mean, what if the Fed really aggravated things by a policy doctrine that we now know to be flawed and so on, in such a way that the recession became the Great Depression. They didn't know it was the Great Depression for a year or more. I mean, it was thought to be a conventional, but if maybe rather severe slump. But as it became a prolonged and Great Depression, then greater pressures arise because of the exhaustion of resources in cities and in key states with high unemployment. So you get to the point where you need the kind, I think the need was there for the kind of New Deal, early New Deal program, just at the human level. But what if the Fed had done certain things to curb that economic slide so that the country might not have faced that sense that it had to go further in the direction of the state?
Of course, we can never expect, individuals running a private agency or a government agency necessarily to be correct all the time. I mean, at this time, the folks who ran the Fed made huge errors. Of course, the folks who were running most of the major banks made even more egregious errors during this period of time. But my question is, since you were suggesting that the New Deal initiatives were the inevitable response of these failures at the time, would you say that modern American conservatives in 1980s, 90s, nowadays, sort of sometimes forget or obfuscate the degree to which the very role of the state was the result of failures within the private sector or failures within local communities to handle the expedient problems of the Great Depression?
Well, two things just come quickly to mind. One is, you may remember that Reagan often talked about the safety net, which was his way, I think, of signaling that he wasn't going to dismantle the whole New Deal apparatus of relief and so on. The other point that comes to mind is that it is very hard to find in conservative circles today, which I monitor for part of my research, anything kind said about Herbert Hoover. Anything. There's a litany, Smoot-Hawley, the tax increase, the high wage policy, again and again and again. And I, as a historian, I guess I wish that we could, in the blogosphere, move beyond what I call soundbite certitudes, where you pick up a little factoid and repeat it ad infinitum and make a point. So the conservatives do not see Hoover as one of them, which I find interesting because in his post-presidential phase, he was a grand old man of the conservative movement, helped William F. Buckley a little in founding National Review, for example, supported Taft for president in 1952, and one can give other examples. But that's the older, obviously public conservative Hoover. But today, you will find maybe a grudging admission that, yes, he was a great humanitarian. There'll be a nodding. So the left doesn't like him for the reasons that he didn't do enough. He's kind of stood in the way, or he tried hard, but he failed. And the conservative view is, yeah, he tried hard and did all the wrong things, and no wonder he failed, and they don't want him either. So,
so he's not a forgotten progressive.
No.
Amongst the right, he's continues to be a reviled progressive.
I hope that in this, I have edited for publication those two posthumous memoirs that somebody, I guess you alluded to in your introduction, that were kept in storage for many years by Hoover's descendants. Both of them, the two memoirs, parallel volumes, came out just 2 or 3 years ago. One called The Crusade Years, about his crusade against collectivism. And you see, and I thank you for saying that in the introduction, that Hoover thought a lot about these issues. And that, I wish, is something that people on the right or left would take to heart. He was not simply trying to sloganize, and he spent enormous amounts of energy, it's amazing, working on these issues and re-arguing the case, partly to vindicate his own reputation, but partly because he thought it was so important. I call him a political orphan.
I agree with you. Yeah. I mean, my own reading of Hoover, which is not nearly as deep as yours, is one of an incredibly thoughtful man, engaged with really, really important ideas. We're going to run out of time, but I thought it would be great to perhaps take 2 questions, maybe before we abandon. So, back there, yes. Judge? Yeah.
Judge Glock, the Miller Center, thank you for a fantastic talk. Just like to say that I think, if anything, you underestimate the consensus on the Depression being the result of the Fed's actions. Everyone from Christina Romer, former chair of Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, Barry Eichengreen over at Berkeley, that seems to have argued that the Fed's failures were the main and necessary and sufficient cause for the failures of the Depression. If that's so, and if I think you say that Hoover did at least have some conception of that, though, my question is, why don't you think he was able to wrestle the Fed more into loosening the money supply? He did appoint 2 heads of the Fed, his friend Eugene Meyer, the president of the New York Federal Reserve. Harrison was a prominent open market believer in a loose money supply. So why don't you think, with these interactions and these actions he took with the Fed, he was unable to force them to do more?
Well, Meyer apparently was more conservative than Hoover, and less. He didn't want to have the RFC, as I recall, intervene so extensively. By the time Hoover got to the point of wanting intervention, Hoover wanted even broader loan-making power by the RFC to business than Congress gave Hoover, at least in the first wave of writing of the legislation. I hope I didn't convey the impression I thought Hoover was aware of the flaws that I tried to spell out with the real. I never heard Hoover refer to the real bills doctrine or get into that kind of thing. But what he wanted the Fed to do, it wasn't necessarily open market purchases. He wanted the Fed to do, and the RFC increasingly, which was partly, I think, set up because the Fed wasn't doing much. He wanted the RFC and the Fed to get credit into the hands of the bankers. But the problem was that even after they did it, the bankers were scared. And I think that is it's not, I don't think I quite accept maybe the premise of your question that Hoover had a deeper understanding of this. My sense is that he knew that credit had to be loosened up, and he was willing to promote that in his way. But I don't think he saw the kinds of problems with the Fed that I've tried to sketch out here today. And I'm glad you mentioned Christina Romer. I've been influenced by some of her articles on this. There's a debate among the economists, as I understand it, between those who would stress more the international factors, the gold standard. That's more taken by I'll call it the more liberal or progressive economists, whereas the Friedman monetarists tend to emphasize the domestic factors and the failures of the Fed. And it's Bernanke said some years ago understand the Great Depression as the holy grail of economics. And my impression is the economists are still at it. But my further impression is that you look at all those specialized journals, which I've been doing, and the economists are having a great time arguing about it, but I don't sense that it's gotten mainstreamed into the narrative as political historians or what others of us who are not specialized economists would naturally take to. So what I was hoping to do is to suggest that maybe we need to, as historians, to absorb a little more of that and see how that affects our judgment of the political actors who didn't know all that much. They knew something was wrong. Hoover, I think, knew pretty much better. He had much more grasp of facts and so on. But I don't think he knew that the real bills doctrine, which was a fallacy, as they tell me it now is. So I hope that's a bit of an answer.
Let's see if we can have one more question. Yes, sir.
Yes.
Since Hoover was,
Could you wait 1 second so you can have a microphone? Yeah. No.
since Hoover was in the Harding and Coolidge administrations, and there was, as you mentioned, a very steep downturn in 1921-22. But that very steep downturn turned around very quickly for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is I think the federal government actually slashed its budget significantly, and apparently the Federal Reserve didn't do much at all. Do you think that perhaps the crash of the market in '29 and the publicity that brought galvanized the Fed to do something, even if it turned out to be wrong?
From what I've read, some would argue that the Fed helped precipitate the Depression of 1920-21 by raising interest rates so much because of the inflation. Okay, and then I've also seen it recently alleged that the Fed changed its policy, and that helped the fast turnaround. Now, there's another view that James Grant, the financial writer, has recently been promulgating in his book, I think The Crash That Cured Itself. It just came out 2 or 3 months ago. I've looked at it, I haven't read it. I think he writes from I'll have to say it technical terms, more Austrian rather than monetarist viewpoint, as I understand it. So his argument is, well, see, if you left things alone, things would have gotten better. The monetarists say, well, no, the Fed helped get us out of it. Hoover had his own explanation. He got Harding to set up this president's the unemployment conference. And what did it do? Well, a lot of it was public relations. The idea was to get all the mayors of the country to set up committees to kind of go out and drum up jobs, you might say. Go to employers, can you hire people, make lists of unemployed in their cities and so on. That was, and do things like...
and increase local spending.
Yes, spruce up campaigns and so at the local level to try to provide some quick relief. And then Hoover thought that the longer-term solution was to have countercyclical public works spending, which is partly popularized by that conference and the subsequent scholarly studies that came from that conference. I think that conference was very important in Hoover's mind in the way that he went about the initial response to the Depression in '29. What did he do? He brought in the industrial, it was some of the same people. I think that affected. He construed, and some of his people construed the quick recovery of 1921-22 as cause and effect. It went up, we just had all these committees, we got the communities organized, we must have had something to do with it. Yes, and so he may have misread the signals there and thinking that it made that much difference. I tend to think that the most important consequence of that unemployment conference was the studies of the business cycle and economic trends and the popularization of just the idea that the government doesn't sit there, it does something. And the thing that everybody was groping for is how can you pace the level of spending on roads and bridges, infrastructure and so forth, so that you can create, if you do it when the economy is going down, that cushions the shock. That provides some employment that to people who would otherwise lose their jobs. So it's counter-cyclical. That's more or less where that concept began to get into the mainstream. And Hoover was very much involved in that and drew upon those people and that kind of thinking, which set him apart from the more conservative types of the 20s.
Well, I think we've gotten a terrific and balanced and measured view of Herbert Hoover's dealings with the crisis of the Great Depression, we all owe George Nash a vote of thanks. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you.